When people are new to security risk, they often assume that identifying a risk automatically means you must eliminate it. But real organizations cannot eliminate every risk without eliminating the business itself. That is why risk management is not just the act of noticing problems, but the disciplined act of choosing what to do about them and recording those choices in a way that can be defended later. Applying risk techniques means taking your evaluation of likelihood, impact, and exposure and turning it into a decision path that is repeatable, transparent, and aligned with business priorities. It also means tracking risks over time so they do not vanish after a meeting and then reappear as surprises months later. The most practical tools for doing this are treatment options, risk registers, and decision documentation, because those tools force clarity about what is being accepted, what is being changed, and who is responsible. For brand new learners, the goal is to understand that risk work is not paperwork for its own sake. It is the mechanism that keeps security decisions consistent when people change roles, when projects shift, and when urgency tries to override discipline. Risk treatment options are the set of basic paths an organization can choose once a risk is identified and evaluated. One option is to mitigate, which means reducing the risk by applying controls that lower likelihood, reduce impact, or shrink exposure. Another option is to transfer, which means shifting some of the financial or operational burden to another party, such as through insurance or contracts, while recognizing that the underlying risk may still exist. Another option is to avoid, which means changing the plan or stopping the activity that creates the risk, such as not deploying a feature or not storing certain data in a certain way. Another option is to accept, which means acknowledging the risk and choosing to live with it, usually because the cost of reduction is higher than the benefit or because the business needs outweigh the residual risk. For beginners, the important idea is that these options are not moral judgments. They are business choices with security consequences. Mitigation is not always possible quickly. Transfer is not a magic shield. Avoidance can be expensive and opportunity cost, and acceptance must be intentional rather than accidental. The purpose of naming these options is to make the conversation more precise, because without clear options, risk discussions become vague arguments where nobody knows what decision is actually being proposed. Once the options are clear, you can ask which option fits the business context and why. Mitigation is often the most common choice in security because it feels like progress, but mitigation must be specific and measurable to be meaningful. Mitigating a risk does not mean promising to improve security generally. It means choosing controls that directly change the risk factors you identified. If likelihood is high because a system is exposed and authentication is weak, mitigation might mean restricting exposure, strengthening authentication, and adding monitoring that detects suspicious access. If impact is high because recovery would be slow, mitigation might mean improving backups, rehearsing recovery, and designing systems so failures are contained. For beginners, the key is connecting the mitigation to the original risk reasoning, because that connection is what makes mitigation defensible. Mitigation also has to be realistic in terms of time and resources, because a mitigation plan that requires years of work while risk remains urgent may need interim steps. This is where staged mitigation becomes valuable, where you apply a quick control to reduce exposure now and a longer-term redesign to reduce risk more deeply later. Another beginner misunderstanding is assuming mitigation always means adding technology, but many mitigations are process or architecture choices, such as limiting privileges, reducing unnecessary connectivity, or tightening change control. The best mitigations often reduce risk across multiple threats, which makes them high leverage. Transfer is a risk treatment option that can be misunderstood because people sometimes imagine it means the risk is gone. In reality, transferring risk usually means transferring some of the cost or liability, not transferring the event itself. Insurance may help cover financial losses, and contracts may require a vendor to meet security standards or share responsibility for certain outcomes, but the organization can still suffer downtime, reputational harm, or customer distrust if an incident occurs. For beginners, it helps to think of transfer as a way to reduce the business shock of an event, not a way to prevent the event. Transfer can also create dependencies, because relying on a vendor or an insurer requires trust and verification, and those relationships must be managed. Another subtle point is that transfer can be partial, where some aspects of the risk are shifted while others remain, which means you still need mitigation for the remaining exposure. Transfer also requires documentation because you need to know what exactly was agreed to and what conditions apply. If you do not understand the terms, you may believe you transferred risk when you did not. Thoughtful risk practice treats transfer as one tool among others, and it is most useful when paired with controls that reduce the chance and impact of incidents in the first place. Avoidance is the most direct way to reduce risk because it removes the activity that creates the risk, but it is often the hardest choice because it can conflict with business goals. Avoidance might mean not deploying a certain feature, not connecting a system to the internet, or not storing certain data that would create a high-impact exposure. For beginners, it can feel like avoidance is simply saying no, but in reality, avoidance is often a strategic redesign decision. If a planned architecture creates unacceptable exposure, you might avoid that design and choose a different approach that still meets the business need with less risk. Avoidance can also mean delaying a launch until certain prerequisites are in place, which is a time-based form of avoidance. The challenge is that avoidance can carry opportunity cost, meaning the business loses potential value by not proceeding. That is why avoidance decisions usually require leadership involvement, because they are business trade-offs, not just security preferences. A beginner should recognize that avoidance is sometimes the wisest choice when the potential impact is catastrophic and controls cannot reduce the risk quickly enough. When used thoughtfully, avoidance prevents high-profile failures that would otherwise define the organization's security story. Acceptance is the option that requires the most discipline, because accepting risk can easily become an excuse for doing nothing. In mature risk practice, acceptance means the organization intentionally decides to live with a defined level of residual risk, and it understands what consequences could follow. Acceptance is often appropriate when the risk is low, when mitigation would cost more than the risk reduction is worth, or when the risk cannot be reduced further without harming the business. For beginners, the key is that acceptance must be explicit and documented, because undocumented acceptance is simply neglect. Documented acceptance includes who accepted it, what they understood, and when the decision should be revisited. Acceptance also benefits from compensating controls, meaning even if you accept that a certain weakness exists, you may still monitor closely or limit exposure so the accepted risk does not quietly grow. Another important point is that acceptance is time-bound in many cases, because environments change, and what was acceptable last year may be unacceptable now. For example, a temporary exception might be accepted during a migration, but it should expire, forcing a reevaluation. Acceptance is not a failure, but it is a responsibility, and that responsibility is why documentation is essential. Risk registers are the tool that makes all of these treatment decisions trackable over time. A risk register is a structured record of identified risks, their evaluations, their owners, and the treatment decisions associated with them. For beginners, it helps to see the risk register as the program's memory because it prevents risks from being discussed once and then forgotten. A register also enables prioritization because it allows leaders to compare risks using consistent criteria and to see which ones are being actively addressed versus which ones are being accepted. The value is not the spreadsheet itself, but the discipline it creates, because it forces clarity about what the risk is, where it exists, and what will be done. A useful register entry typically includes a clear risk statement, the affected assets or processes, the evaluation of likelihood and impact, and the current exposure context. It also includes the chosen treatment option, the rationale for that choice, the person responsible for follow-through, and a target timeline or review date. When those elements are present, the register becomes actionable rather than bureaucratic. For beginners, the biggest lesson is that a register is not a list of vulnerabilities, because vulnerabilities are technical findings, while risks are business threats tied to outcomes. A well-used risk register also supports communication across teams because it creates a shared view of what is being worked on and why. If a technology team is asked to prioritize remediation, the register can show that the work is tied to a specific risk and that leadership understands its importance. If leadership asks why a security project is needed, the register can provide the rationale in consistent language. It also supports accountability because owners can be asked to report progress, and the register can record whether mitigation actions are complete or stalled. Another benefit is that the register can reveal patterns, such as repeated risks in the same domain, which may indicate systemic issues like weak identity governance or inconsistent segmentation. For beginners, this shows how risk techniques move beyond individual incidents and toward program learning. The register can also help manage exceptions, because accepted risks and temporary waivers can be tracked with expiration dates and review requirements. Without a register, exceptions often become permanent by accident, quietly increasing exposure. With a register, exceptions become visible, which makes it easier to keep the program aligned with its intended risk posture. Decision documentation is the third part of this episode title, and it is the piece that protects the organization from confusion and blame later. Decision documentation means recording what was decided, why it was decided, what assumptions were used, and who approved it. In security, decisions are often made under uncertainty, and weeks or months later people may forget the context that made a decision reasonable. Without documentation, teams can waste time relitigating the same debate, or they can make inconsistent decisions because they do not know what was decided previously. Documentation also supports audit and governance, but its primary value is operational because it preserves reasoning and accountability. For beginners, it helps to think of decision documentation like writing down directions before a trip because it keeps everyone aligned on the route and reduces wrong turns. Documentation does not need to be long, but it needs to be clear enough that someone who is not present can understand the rationale. It should also include what would cause the decision to be revisited, such as new evidence, changed exposure, or a missed timeline. That revisit trigger is important because it keeps decisions from becoming stale. Decision documentation also helps prevent a common failure mode, where security teams become the default risk acceptors even when they do not have the authority to accept business risk. In mature practice, business leaders accept business risk, and security leaders advise, assess, and propose options. Documentation clarifies who accepted the risk and what they understood, which protects both the security team and the organization. It also clarifies what mitigation was chosen and who owns delivery, which reduces the chance that work falls between teams. For beginners, this is a key lesson because it connects risk techniques to governance and decision rights. When decision rights are unclear, documentation becomes even more important because it can reveal the gap and force the organization to clarify authority. Another benefit is that documentation supports learning after incidents, because you can compare what was assumed to what actually happened. If an accepted risk later causes a problem, the organization can learn whether the acceptance was reasonable or whether assumptions were flawed. That learning is how risk practice improves over time, rather than repeating the same mistakes. A practical way to apply these techniques is to treat risk management as a cycle rather than a one-time assessment. You identify risks, evaluate them, choose treatment options, record them in the register, and document decisions. Then you track progress and revisit as conditions change. This cycle works best when it has a consistent cadence, such as regular reviews where owners update status and leaders make trade-offs. For beginners, the key is that the cycle creates predictability, so risk does not become a panic-driven activity that only happens after incidents. It also creates transparency, so teams are less likely to hide problems or ignore risks because they feel overwhelmed. The cycle can also include validation, meaning checking whether mitigation actions actually reduced likelihood, impact, or exposure, rather than assuming they did. When validation is part of the cycle, risk practice becomes evidence-driven. Another important point is that risk techniques should be applied proportionally, meaning high-impact risks deserve deeper documentation and stronger governance, while low-impact risks can be handled more lightly. Proportionality keeps the process from becoming bureaucratic and helps maintain speed. The goal is to keep risk work useful, not heavy. Beginners should also understand that risk techniques are only effective when they connect to real program execution. A risk register that is not tied to roadmaps and backlogs becomes a list of worries rather than a tool for progress. Decision documentation that does not lead to ownership and timelines becomes a historical record rather than a driver of action. Treatment options that are chosen without follow-through become performative, meaning they make people feel better without changing the environment. This is why ownership clarity matters so much, because someone must be responsible for moving mitigation forward and for reporting status. It is also why leadership support matters, because some mitigations require cross-team coordination and resource allocation. For beginners, the lesson is that risk management is not a separate world from security operations and security engineering. It is the layer that aligns those efforts to business priorities and ensures trade-offs are made consciously. When risk techniques are integrated into program management, security becomes more strategic and less reactive. Risks become drivers for planned improvement rather than recurring surprises. As you bring everything together, applying risk techniques means turning risk awareness into disciplined choices that can be tracked and defended. Treatment options give you a clear set of paths, including mitigating to reduce likelihood or impact, transferring to shift some burden, avoiding to remove the risky activity, and accepting to live with defined residual risk intentionally. Risk registers provide a shared, durable record so risks are not forgotten. Priorities can be compared, and owners can be held accountable for progress. Decision documentation preserves reasoning, clarifies authority, and prevents the organization from repeating debates or misremembering why choices were made. For a brand new learner, the most important takeaway is that risk techniques are a way to make security decisions fair, consistent, and transparent, even when the environment is uncertain and resources are limited. They keep the program from being driven only by fear or convenience, and they allow the organization to learn over time because decisions and outcomes can be compared. When these techniques are applied thoughtfully, security becomes a managed discipline, and managed disciplines are the ones that improve steadily rather than swinging between crisis and neglect.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.